Chapter 8. As Corey had predicted, the living room had to double as the third bedroom. Even though I had another solution in mind, it would have to wait until the big freeze was over, or until Corey could get out his carpenter tools, whichever came first. The boys slept on the large camelback sofa, a wedding gift from Corey's parents, that pulled out into a double bed. It was old when Corey's parents bought it secondhand soon after arriving in Oregon. They had it reupholstered, and then after our marriage, it had been reupholstered again in an embossed turquoise fabric. The boys' dressers, games, and athletic equipment were stored in the one big bedroom. That arrangement worked okay, except that every time I was napping, the boys would be rummaging around for balls and bats. The dining room was similarly overwhelmed. We placed the piano against the wall between the living room and the dining room. Our solid walnut table and 8 chairs, which had looked so elegant at Holgate, except that it had never received the refinishing Corey had promised when we bought it at the secondhand store, had to be pushed up against the outside wall. The matching walnut buffet was placed against the knotty pine wall, and above it I hung my scenic blue plate, Faneuil Hall in Boston, along with a platter from my set of Crown Ducal English bone china. My parents had brought me the set, 144 pieces in all, before I was married. I never imagined I'd have an occasion grand enough to use it all at once. Corey came in while I was finishing up. "How come you've put the kitchen curtains in the dining room?" "I had to put them where they fit. These windows are not a conventional size." Corey chortled. "Tell me about it." I didn't need to. He had pointed that out on his first inspection. The dining room and kitchen were later additions to the house, which explained many peculiarities, especially the windows. The older section of the house had conventional windows with lead weights and all, but in the dining room and kitchen, there were 4 peepholes, as one might call them, measuring 2 feet by 3, evenly dotted along the outside walls. Corey was exasperated. "I can't figure out why anyone would place windows like these. They sure aren't for seeing out of, not for a normal-sized person anyway. If you stand up, they're too low, and if you sit down, they're too high. You're not supposed to look out while you're eating. You're supposed to admire the plates I've hung on the pine wall." Talking about walls, have you noticed the quarter round? Had I noticed the quarter round? It was everywhere. Every joint and corner was covered, or patched up to be more accurate, with this simple convex molding. Even the corners of the papered walls. I knew from experience how difficult it was to wallpaper into gaps, especially when the walls weren't plumb, but I'd never thought of using quarter round. "Maybe the builder worked in a quarter round factory and got it wholesale?" I quipped. "No, he'd have gotten a better grade. In some places, the quarter round is worse than the sins it's covering, like in the hall to the bathroom. By the way, you're not going to leave the clothes hamper there, are you? One day, one of your sons will race through there, hit the hamper, knock down the quarter round, and bring down the ceiling. That'll be the end of your little hall, and you'll have to go around the house and come in through the bathroom window." "I know, but where else?" He was on a roll. "But that won't bother you. It'll be kind of like having outdoor plumbing, which you like. The basics." In spite of his predictions and the obvious dangers, I left the hamper there. It was just one of a multitude of things I couldn't find a place for. During the unpacking, I tried to keep some baked goods in the cupboard. I knew we'd soon have visitors welcoming us to the community. Jean Thompson, for instance. I often glanced down at their place, hoping to spot a spry young woman in a pretty dirndl, leading a baby calf and carrying a milk pail, as Mrs. Johnson had said about my age. My first visitor, however, was not Mrs. Thompson, and she wasn't leading a baby calf. She was more the Liz Taylor type. I seated her at the dining room table with a cup of coffee and a cinnamon roll. She seemed to feel that if she surveyed the room, she'd be obligated to comment, so she just concentrated on my pastry. "Home-baked?" she asked. I nodded pleasantly. She set about informing me on the state of the union, as it were. I began to suspect that Happy Valley was not as full of fun and games as one might be led to believe. She confirmed what Mrs. Johnson had told me about the 2 opposing factions, the old settlers, many of whom were descendants of the original residents, and the Johnny-come-latelys. I was surprised when she identified herself as a member of the PTA and began a discourse on the decadence of the school system. "It's just terrible that we don't have a school bus. It's difficult for parents to have to drive the children to school. A community this size should certainly be able to afford one. Why, if we pooled all the money we spend on gas, we'd have a bus paid for in no time." Her attitude brought out my aggressions. Here I had moved to the country to pioneer, and the first person I ran into was a city slicker. "What's wrong with walking?" I asked. She looked baffled. "Walking? My dear, it's a long way up a steep hill." I expressed my feelings about children's need for exercise, and she picked up on that. "Yes, that's another thing. We are all working hard to get a gym." This sparked another debate. Finally, she stood up. "I understand you are a musician," she said, looking at my old beat-up piano. "It would be nice if you'd play at our next meeting." I accepted, more to get her moving than anything. Right away, I regretted it. It was no time to be adding to my already heavy load. I was still trying to figure out how I would manage driving around to my piano students' homes. As she breezed out the door, I hoped my next visitor would be more of the country bumpkin type. That wish came true the evening a large red farm truck pulled into our driveway. I watched through the window as the driver rolled himself out of the driver's seat and came up the path around the apple tree. I went to the door. His breath was a plume of mist. "I'm Arlo Thompson. I live right down the road." I tried to evaluate him through the dim arc of the porch light. A little younger than Corey, a little shorter, but carrying a lot more meat on his bones. I invited him in, but he shook his head. "I came up to check my electric fence. I've got my transformer hooked up to your blockhouse." He explained that he owned the pasture below ours and had also rented our back pasture from the Johnsons, all of which was surrounded by electric fence. "In this weather, I'm not using the pasture, and I want to be sure it's off so that your neighbor in the filbert orchard won't get shocked when his truck skids down the hill." He sensed my question but didn't give me a chance to ask it. His battery is usually dead, so he backs down his driveway to get started, but before the engine turns over, he's into the fence. I told him of the discussion Corey and I had about building so close to the property line, with a big old barn cutting out their view. Arlo said, "Well, when they bought the property, that was 3 or 4 years ago, they had grandiose ideas, but—" I waited breathlessly for him to continue, but instead he said, "Well, I've got my own ideas, but I don't like to spread rumors." That, as I was to find out, was Arlo's method. He'd give you all the facts right up to the cliff and then leave you hanging. But I can tell you this, property lines can cause bad feelings. The Johnsons had a run-in with them, and every time they back down into my fence, they claim I built it on their property. You'll have trouble with them too. I couldn't help but laugh, but then I felt sorry for him and determined that I would do my best to get along with my new neighbors. The Christian thing to do. "Is it okay if we keep this arrangement? I'll use your pasture and electricity in exchange for milk." I agreed, so he explained the fence hookup, but I wasn't really listening. I considered them a modern invention. Mama was raised on a horse ranch, and she had never told me about electric fences. The most I knew was that people shouldn't ski into them or drive their cars into them. Besides, I was half frozen. He pointed to a stub of a branch on the apple tree where he customarily hung the milk jug. I moved closer. I shouldn't have. The back porch was slick and my feet went out from under me. There I was, laid out flat and flustered, trying to pull my skirt over my bright red knee socks. Arlo paid little attention and turned to go. "Well, I tell you to come down and visit the wife, but her teeth have been bothering her. Guess she's got to have 'em all pulled." There went my illusions of a young woman in a colorful dirndl. When Corey came home, I asked, "How old would you say I am?" I don't have to say I know. But if you didn't know, and I told you I had to have all of my teeth pulled, what would you say? Corey looked puzzled.